I'm John Eckstrom, and this is For Art's Sake. I'm the painter of all these objects of art around here, and I want to talk to you today about them. But I would at least first like to thank Lisa Costello, the gallery director, and Parkland in general for giving me this opportunity. I'm very appreciative. To begin with, we always begin at the beginning. This painting behind me, called New York School, is one of the earliest paintings in the show. This was a result of the New York School, which was going on in, obviously, New York at that time. A big school, one of the most important ones of the last century. Why? Because New York was flooded with European immigrants escaping from the wars, and coupled with the American artists there, that was a very fertile combination and produced one of the most advanced dynamic schools of all. The hallmark of the school was, well, they called it abstract expressionism. I think that was coined by one of the critics, Harold Rosenberg. Harold Rosenberg and Clement Greenberg were two major critics at the time. They fueled this school with their excellent documentary comments, and it was a pretty powerful thing. But Jackson Pollock was coming out of the school, Willem de Kooning. I mean, there's the who's who in art really started there as far as American art goes. The kind of the dynamic hallmark of this was action painting. You see how dynamic this is. This was the arena in which you acted, and it was just extraordinarily dynamic. You didn't finish until you were done with it. I mean, it wasn't something you were kind of picking around on. The style here was bold and athletic, full of energy. Think of Jackson Pollock out there throwing paint down on his in his garage, where he was dipping right into the can and throwing it around. That captured much of the spirit of this school. And this is very typical of it. I mean, notice the big movements here. Well, actually, that stayed with me all my life, and so when I start work, I'm always asking of myself to have some of that dynamism and energy. So, what happens to an artist after his school goes on and disappears and is replaced by another school? Well, life still goes on. You're a little disillusioned, and you wonder, how did that happen? These schools in the last century came by very fast. Let's take the example, optical. That was and it was just what it sounded like. It's something that dealt with the eyes. And it was like a moire pattern. It was hard on the eyes. That would appeal to only a few artists. It was so demanding and so tedious. So that didn't last very long. But to take pop, which is still with us today, pop was amazing. I mean, Andy Warhol was quite an interesting figure. But really what pop did was to introduce new subject matter into the arts. If you could draw a Campbell's soup can or a Brillo soapbox or something like that, anything was okay. You didn't have to draw horses and carriages anymore. You could paint almost anything, and it's still with us today. Okay, enough of this background and history. Let's take a look at this this big ocean seaside picture here. This was a result of my spending a lot of time on the Santa Monica beaches every summer. And this is an unusual painting in the sense that I have a couple little sketches over here that when I wanted to do this, I put them in my sketchbook, worked them out, did a little color one, and it was amazing that the painting came out looking just like these. Usually it goes through so many transformations. This is almost exactly the sketch there. The only thing that I had to do was to put in this little girl, which I did later on. And I did a little sketch of her in the sketchbook, this little shivering girl, and it was a done deal. I think the thing went together so quickly. But you can still see the New York school in the way that I'm brushing everything, the leaving color, the general dynamics. I mean, look at this very casual rendering here. That's me. This version of a beach scene is a little different. This is more academic. I decided that I wanted to deal with some acrylic flashy brushwork here, and so I used these little children as examples. I actually kind of made them up, although I took a lot of pictures of kids. You know, I took pictures of people on the beach, but I never copied them. I mean, I just used them as sort of reference. For me, if I don't do it directly myself, then it just starts to look static. Anyway, this was really an exercise in kind of impressionistic brushwork. And with acrylics, it's very watery. This is on Masonite, by the way, but it's, you know, you could change this, you could take her out and put her in just a few seconds. No big deal there. So it was kind of fun. Well, we'll talk about these two drawings since we're right here. This one, what did I call this? The depths. It was a little unusual in the sense that almost all the drawing occurred in little plackets here, little squares, as though they were all somehow underwater. And some of these forms actually look sort of like underwater creatures. So there's a kind of a loose association there to being in water. This one, on the other hand, is a kind of, deals with death, a kind of skeletal, chalky framework of a dead bird here, wings and head, eye socket. It didn't start out that way. I don't know what I was really doing. This is what a drawer does. He likes to make form, and all of a sudden that form starts to form something. And then you say, oh, well, I guess I'll follow that lead and go with it. So that's what happened here. Again, I'm using, well, let me just back up and say that all of the drawings in this show are fairly heavy, high contrast works. And that resulted from using really heavy leads, 10B, 20B. That's the softness of the graphite that you use. And this was in some ways to compensate for the wonderful darks that the printmakers made when I was in grad school. I was a little jealous of their darks, and so I tried to find a way to do this. Actually, I took printmaking for several years, and Lee Chesney, the charismatic print professor at that time, was my mentor, and I looked up to these people with their beautiful dark prints, but for myself, it was too slow. I needed to make changes on the fly. I'm a very quick thinker, and at least in the arts. And so I wanted something I could move a little quicker with, and so I chose, you know, drawing. But this is how these darks originated. I started to use a lot of darks. I would use a terp wash in there that is taking terp and pulling down some gray smoothness with it, using an electric eraser. I mean, in other words, treating these fairly dynamically. You know, I wasn't trying to sketch nature. This is what we did at Parkland. This is a typical Parkland painting example. I would often, since I was teaching painting at the time, I would paint right along with the students, mainly as a kind of ongoing demo for them to see how I would treat this, or how, you know, somebody who knew what they were doing. But this again is a very impressionistic thing. I got a big kick out of playing with the fork here with as little as possible. And just a little flick of the glare on a glass or the bottle of wine or these little silver goblets is all it takes. For me, less is always more. When I try to get down to the bare essence of something, it does get at the essence. That's what's so much fun. How much can I get away with here with how little? Not that I'm actually lazy, but I think it's a little bit of magic if you can make this little goblet work with just a few strokes. But then there are many artists who've done this over the years. You know, I'm thinking of Sargent for one. Anyway, this was a very kind of typical thing that Parkland painters might be attacking. All right, looking at these three drawings, this one is called Warrior, and this is one of the few times I decided I really wanted to draw a personage in there. And it also was, I think, the first time that I used frottage. Now, frottage is something that was invented by Max Ernst, one of the great French surrealists, and he did a lot of work. If you want to look at frottage, look it up in Google, you'll see tons of it. But basically it's like making a gravestone rubbing. You put something underneath the paper and run over it with a heavy lead, and you get all kinds of wonderful little things like this. It's easy to see which ones are frottage because you couldn't really make them happen any other way. They gave it a kind of magical illusion of form that you just couldn't do if you had to actually work around it. Anyway, this was kind of fun. I get a big kick out of today is the films and all the serials and things in the TV are using, you know, these historical dramas where the people are wearing all this armor and stuff, and yet they have ray guns and they're magic swords and they can fly and do. There's a funny disconnect between the primitiveness of the costume and what they can do. This one, what do we call this one? Birth. The challenge was to make a big sort of oval circular frame for it, or not a frame, but, well, yeah, an armature, and then break it up into little pockets. And by breaking it up into little pockets, you tend to look at actually every one of those little areas like you held a magnifying glass up to it. It frames it. And then there's a frame within a frame. So we have the little circle down here, and this is sort of a hole or a void, and we see maybe some element of the beginning of birth right there. This painting, what did I call it? Analytic, all right. Well, basically it's my architectural side, where I would use, whereas these have a lot of soft stuff going around. These are simple, hard architectural planes, and it's locked in there in a very building manner. I mean, there's to soften the geometric aspects, there's a little stuff going on here. The little things in the picture actually act as a kind of balance for the larger elements. It was fun really trying to figure out how to get gradients in here, how to enliven this picture with stripes and some of these little things that are happening. This kind of painting or drawing is a lot different than these because it's much more controlled, much more pre-planned in a way, which is hard for me. These two early drawings over here, I think these are probably some of the most early drawings in the show. This is where I began to really get a good grasp of my vocabulary. Building a vocabulary is important for us because I'm using these stripes and things throughout my life. They become part of you. They are a part of what you do. And these were two versions, actually, of almost the same thing. They both had big stripes as sort of an armature for the thing, and then lots of little stuff circling in and around and in front of them, one in color and one in black and white. Each one, I think this one probably holds up a little better, but just because value is a stronger element than color for the most part in drawing. Drawing requires an edge, and so if you use light color, you can make a dark edge and you're okay. But once the color gets heavier and heavier, then it's no longer becomes has a drawing character about it.
Live play-by-play coverage of Parkland sports. Live the action live. Coversports.net.
Well, here we have a series of small Prismacolor drawings. Now, Prismacolor is it's a colored pencil. It's fairly hard and waxy, and it's very popular. You can buy them everywhere. And they have a nice range of colors, and it's a very nice sketching pencil. You can actually dilute them with brush turpentine on them and make them look very watercolor-like. However, most of these were done as just a stroking kind of thing. Since you're using a colored pencil, all these little strokes, all the values has to be built up by lots of strokes. So there's a big chance, a big opportunity here for dynamism, because just the sheer staccato effect of all those little strokes is part of the movement and the energy of the drawing. Just for an example, as a rule of thumb, if I have a long panel like this, an arm sticking up in the air, I'm not going to render it this way. That'll enforce the speed of the arm. Your eye will be out of the picture before you know it. Doing it this way holds your vision on the arm and around it. Now that's just a rough artistic rule of thumb. I mean, it's something you don't have to be, but it works pretty well. I mean, since we have this tall body, I'm going against the grain much of the time. And that way I can also move in and out. I can darken the legs and come in and out. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. These pictures are of a little puto in the back of my son's backyard in Riverside. I spent a lot of summers there, not whole summers, but looking after my grandson Ram, and he was just a little kid then. And so I had a lot of opportunity to look at this thing. And so it became one of my themes. I had seen it so often, and I really enjoyed it. I mean, this is very typical, the cooker and the easy chair. This is looking out the front window on Riverside. It was amazing, these big, tall cypress trees. It looked like I was in Mars or some faraway place. Well, as you can see, the puto here, or putti, the two of them, is very similar to those little Prismacolor drawings I did. And basically, it was just an enlarged version in acrylic paint. And I'm still stroking against the long dimension of the body here, wrapping these paint strokes around almost like a mummy, kind of giving it a lot of interest. But it's easy to model this way, and it's also easier to create some painterly activity, which is it's the fun of looking at paintings. I'm not trying to just render this thing in a photographic sense. I'm trying to make a painting out of it. And of course, this occurred in the background. This is probably the most creative area over here, trying to make this anonymous background work. I'm also very pleased with this negative shape here. These are positive shapes. This is a negative shape. Negative shapes generally stay in the background, and people don't really pay much attention to them, but they do have an effect. And this one is particularly lively because we pick up an edge here, we pick up an edge there, and there. But also in reverse, this thing also picks up an edge from this negative shape. So there's a little odd conflict there that creates an extra interest in the painting. That's a secret you could probably put in your diary or something. The idea of having night and day, or night and day, is interesting because you tend to compare them. You look at this one, then you go over and look at that one. So that idea of finding a way to compare things is it's a long-standing artistic notion that it works. These paintings use the very same thing. I'm comparing this side with this side, this opening versus that opening. I'm running back and forth looking at these things. Okay, talking about this one generally, this is a delicate procedure. I feel like I'm a surgeon now, putting on the white gloves here. My dad was an MD, so maybe there is some medical overtones to this picture. But this is one after that I began to go, instead of having the heavy darks of using really strong, deep, soft leads, I began to use the eraser more to clean up the thing, but to leave a lot of tone here so that you have a very shallow sense of surface there. And these puncture holes here do look like, they look like a medical procedure of some sorts. And but we use this idea in drawing 2, the advanced drawing class, because you could develop planes. It was a very vigorous sort of hands-on kind of activity that created some really nice things. This one over here is very much the same too. We have 2 big long verticals here with a framework holding them in and giving you something. And it has some darks here, but much of this lightest area there is similar to this one over here. This one has a sort of dark medieval thing, this strap iron here and these skin-like, well. This one is kind of a pure drawing here. I don't know, I think circles for me are spheres, they're in my work a lot. I use them, and so I decided to just see if I could, make a couple of rows of them without any special theme, except to try to make the spheres as interesting as I could. In here, I'm using an eraser, but also an electric eraser. I use an electric eraser a lot because I can draw with it. It isn't just for taking out mistakes, it's actually for making a white line, so to speak. So that's how this one evolved. I think it's kind of interesting that these strange cannonball shapes are so, they're kind of threatening in a way. We don't know what those big things are for and what their ultimate purpose was. And they don't look so, you wouldn't want them on your, well, maybe you would, I don't know, on your living room coffee table, so to speak. This little portrait of me here was done in Prismacolors, and it's amazing how much you can get with just a few colors there. And I was working like this, looking up over my glasses. So, of course, I was a little younger there, but age happens to us all. This was an early drawing. It was a drawing that, I don't know, I must have been just fooling around with a cotton swab with some chirp on it, and I came along and made some marks, and I said, wow, does that look neat? So then I started doing this all over the painting, and voila, I had a technique that I could play with and expand upon. And so it's amazing how well that fills in for the background. I mean, you could do it was one of those happy little accidents that you put in your hip pocket and save for other paintings and drawings. A lot of erasing in here. This is all sort of traditional thing. I guess I think this was meant to be a record. I was really into hi-fi building turntables at those days. Now we're really entering the modern era. This was done only 2008. It was pretty recent. This was the first gouache that I did that was, I felt, successful and had it felt like a painting. And I had done several others prior to this, and they're still laying around, and I still intend to work with them, do something to them, but they seem to have not gotten off the ground, primarily because they were they didn't have enough contrast in them. Obviously, I'm going back to my heavy blacks here and making this green really stand out because of that. So, by the way, this big fern was out in California in Lee Chesley's home in a patio where I babysit their house every year for a month. That's why I was often out in California. Anyway, this big thing was sitting there, and so I did it, and eventually it worked out. I think the key to this was simply making the dark background here. This one was a second version of it, a kind of AM/PM, more night and day comparison. And it invites comparison. You look at this one, then you look at that one, back and forth, in different kinds of lights. So that's the way it worked. Of course, trying to create a little interest in this abstract background, that was a bit of a trick. But I would say that these acrylics are fairly flexible. I mean, after I get a dark line here, I can come up with a brush and wash that line out and let it fade over there. There's a lot of nice things you can do, but it's very hard to make a big change. It's because the old paint picks up, and if I tried to block this out and make it white so I could start over again, I'd have a heck of a time. It would be very difficult. I could paint acrylic over it, which is not water soluble, but that leaves a different surface. So it's not always so easy, but it is watercolor-like in the sense when you use it thin enough. Did I say what, well, I should say what gouaches are. Basically, they're kind of an opaque watercolor, but not super opaque. You can see, if you use them thinly, they're very transparent, just like a watercolor. But you can actually intensify them by mixing them thicker, and they'll be more or less opaque. Some colors are more opaque anyway. That little blue is down there. Yeah. Some pigments, by their nature, have a sense of transparency, whereas others are more opaque. Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure bringing all this work here. I think anyone that has to look at the span of their life with whatever they accomplished is a little daunting and a little humbling. I look around at these works, which are admittedly some of the better ones, and I'm not showing you all the really clunkers that I did. Somehow to get these good ones, you have to go through maybe some ones that are not quite so great. But anyway, as I look at these, it gives me a sense of my life, and it's a lot better than I was imagining it. I'm thinking, well, gee whiz, Eckstrom, you weren't so bad. My goodness, this is kind of fun to see all these nice things here, and to hear the wonderful comments that people have come up to me. I figured, well, they must be all just putting me on, but no, I think they actually were honest, and it was very gratifying to be appreciated. I think that's what the ultimate desire of all artists is, to be somehow appreciated for what their work was. Whether they sell or don't sell or make a lot of money or not, being able to be well thought of is a pretty big deal. And I think as I struggled and gathered these paintings together, they're like mileposts in my life. I mean, I knew, this takes me right back to the ocean. I'm back in New York fighting with de Kooning and Rothko and all the big hitters there. These things are all part of it. I look over that still life, and I'm thinking that I'm, elbowing Manet out of the way. This is what they were doing at the turn of the century. So to see all these paintings reminds me of all the influences that I assimilated or that took me. And it's been a very rich life. I wouldn't have changed it for a word. After doing all this talking makes me want to get back into teaching again, as you probably have guessed. Well, I'll leave that to the younger kids, but to say a few final words, I want to just thank you for all of you out there who have seen the work and have come up and talked to me about it and have enjoyed it, and I've enjoyed it myself. It's been a very rewarding experience, and I'll just have to talk Lisa into having it done every year. I don't know about that. So thank you, one and all.